All right, let's dive in. We're tackling this whole achieving your goals thing today, but with a bit of a different angle. We're not going to get all into like smart goals and productivity hacks, you know?
Yeah,
It's more about the deeper stuff, like what's the mindset, what's the motivation you need to actually get things done.
sounds good.
We're using this interview with Rob Dial as a guide he wrote, Level Up, and he was talking with Jay Shetty on his podcast. And get this, one of the things he talks about is how being afraid to make $1 million might be holding you back.
Okay, that's a new one. Got to hear more about that.
Yeah, we'll get there. But he also gets into finding your why, even connecting to silence. Oh, and there's a bit about how polar bears process trauma, which, believe it or not, is pretty relevant.
I have to say, that's an interesting mix of topics. I'm curious to see how it all comes together.
Me too. So first up is this fear thing. Dial talks about two kinds of fear, primal and intellectual. Primal fears, those are the ones that are basically built into us, right? Like, I don't know, fear of heights, spiders, the stuff that kept our ancestors alive. But intellectual fears, those are different.
Yeah, those are the ones we basically kind of create in our own heads, right?
Yeah.
Like that fear of failing or what people will think of you.
Exactly. And it's crazy because even though those fears aren't like actual physical danger right here, right now, they can feel super real.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Like, haven't you ever had a nightmare and you wake up and your heart is still pounding, even though nothing really happened? It's crazy how our minds can create these intense reactions, even to things that are only in our imagination.
Dial uses this example of imagining a tiger chasing you. Even though it's just a thought, your body reacts like it's really happening. You get all the stress hormones, your heart rate goes up, the whole deal. And those feelings, even if they're from something you just imagined, can be paralyzing, right? I mean, how many times have you not done something because you're too afraid of what people would say?
Oh, yeah. Been there for sure. And that's where, like, what Dial says about awareness comes in. He talks about how we need to actually, like, notice those negative thought patterns and then actually try to challenge them.
And he's got this three-step thing: awareness, practice, repetition. So first, you just got to notice that fear-based thought. Then you try out a new, more positive way to respond. And then you just keep doing that over and over until it starts to feel more natural.
So it's kind of like you're training a muscle, right?
Yeah.
You're building up that mental strength
Yeah.
to react differently to those kind of automatic fear-based thoughts.
Exactly. And get this, he says the thoughts we repeat the most actually become the most ingrained in our minds.
Right.
So think about the things you're telling yourself every single day. Are they like lifting you up or dragging you down? If it's the second one, well, then it's time to start practicing some different responses.
Yeah. We really don't realize how powerful our own self-talk can be. Like we're constantly telling ourselves these stories, and those stories, they can either empower us or completely limit us.
Dial even talks about how his own view of fear changed when he was like deciding if he should do podcasting full time. He realized that staying stuck in a job he hated was actually scarier than taking the risk of maybe failing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Sometimes that fear of not doing anything is stronger than the fear of actually doing something.
That really makes you think about what we might be missing out on just because we're letting those intellectual fears, be in charge. Like maybe what we think is safe is actually the thing holding us back from like really reaching our potential.
That's a really good point to think about. Like, what fears are keeping you from taking that next step, whatever that might be for you? And is that fear really helping you, or is it just keeping you stuck? And that actually leads us perfectly into this next big theme: discovering your why.
Yeah. This is where it gets really interesting because Dial says that having a strong why, like a really deep motivating purpose behind what you want to do, it's totally crucial to actually get yourself moving and overcome obstacles.
He actually says this pretty bold thing. I'm curious to hear what you think he says. If your why is strong enough, your how will reveal itself.
Hmm.
It's like saying that you'll figure out the steps you need to take once you're really connected to why you're doing something in the first place.
It's funny because when you think about it, how often do we get so bogged down in the how without ever really figuring out the why? Like we get so lost in all the details and to-do lists that we forget about the big picture.
That's it. To make this point, Dial uses a pretty extreme example. He asks his listeners, what are the chances of you making $1 million this year? Most people would be like, zero chance, right?
Yeah, for most of us, that seems pretty impossible.
Right. But then he asks, what if the lives of everyone you love depended on you making $1 million? Like, what if it was the only way to save them? Suddenly, those odds change a lot, right? The how might still be a mystery, but that why is so powerful that it makes you take incredible action.
That puts things in perspective for sure. It shows how much our motivation is tied to how deep our why really is.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about wanting something, it's about, like, needing it at your core.
And to find that why, Dial says we got to go deeper than just those surface level wants. He tells this story about a coaching client of his. This guy initially said he wanted to make $100,000 that year. But after Dial kept asking why is that important to you, they got to a much deeper motivation.
I'm guessing it wasn't actually about the money. Right.
You got it. Turns out what this guy really wanted deep down was to be able to provide a safe and stable life for his kids. That was his real driving force, the emotional heart of his goal. I bet a lot of us can relate to that. We often set goals based on what we think we should want, but when we take the time to really ask ourselves, why is this important to me? We tap into a whole different level of motivation.
Like, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion, right? You got to keep asking why until you get to that real core of it all. And that's where the real power is.
Yes, and that's a big takeaway right there for anyone listening, right? What are those deeper motivations behind the goals you're setting? What are you really, truly working towards? Because when you connect that deeper level of purpose, procrastination, and all that self-doubt, it starts to fade away. It becomes less about, I should do this, and more about, I need to do this.
It makes me wonder what would be possible if we all just took the time to really figure out those deep whys. What kind of impact could we have, both on ourselves and on the world around us, if we were all coming from that place of real, authentic motivation?
That's a powerful thought. And speaking of impact, this is where Dial's conversation kind of takes a more spiritual turn. He starts talking about how he actually schedules in time for silence and reflection in his life.
Which is kind of the opposite of what we're always told to do, right? We're supposed to be productive and hustling all the time.
Right. But Dial actually makes time for stillness. He calls it connecting to the silence. And he believes that in those quiet moments, that's when we can access our deepest insights and wisdom. Think about it. How many times have you been trying so hard to figure something out and then the answer just pops into your head when you're like in the shower or taking a walk, just letting your mind wander?
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's like our brains need some space to just process and connect all the dots. It's almost as if those creative solutions and insights are already there, but we got to quiet down all the noise to actually hear them.
And he even says the universe speaks in silence. It's about trusting that the answers we're looking for are often already inside us. We just got to create the space to listen to them.
That's a powerful concept. It's like silence isn't empty, it's actually full of potential. Like a space where we can reconnect with ourselves, tap into our intuition, and find a sense of peace that's hard to find in all the chaos of everything going on around us.
And it's not just about like spiritual stuff or peace of mind either. Dial talks about how being still has actually helped him get better at achieving his goals.
I can see that. Like when you can quiet down all those thoughts swirling around your head, you get this clarity and focus that you just can't have when you're constantly bombarded with distractions. It's like clearing off a super messy desk so you can actually get some work done.
Exactly. And this is where he brings in this really fascinating study about polar bear trauma. Now, stick with me on this one because it actually connects to this whole stillness and processing emotions thing. Researchers saw that after polar bears were tranquilized, they would physically shake.
Sounds like a natural way to release something.
Right. It's like their bodies were automatically letting go of all the stress and fear of that whole experience. And Dial makes this connection between that and how we, as humans, tend to just bottle up our emotions instead of letting ourselves feel them and release them.
Yeah, we're always told to toughen up and hide our vulnerability. But maybe there's actually more strength in acknowledging those emotions. Like letting ourselves actually feel them fully and then letting them go.
It's like that shaking motion is a way of saying, okay, I've dealt with this, now I can move on. And maybe we need to figure out our own healthy ways of doing the same thing, whether it's, through breath work or journaling, talking to a therapist, or even just letting ourselves have a good cry. It's important to actually make space to process those difficult emotions so they don't stay trapped inside.
It's about understanding that our emotions aren't the enemy. They're trying to tell us something. And when we actually listen to them, we can learn and grow in some really profound ways.
And that brings us to another big theme in this conversation, connecting to our true selves. Dial says that we often look for validation from outside ourselves when what we're really craving is self-acceptance and love.
That seems to come up a lot in personal growth conversations. It's that whole idea that true happiness and fulfillment, it comes from inside us, not from stuff we achieve or things we buy.
He talks about how he used to think that if he achieved certain things, made money, got recognized, bought nice stuff, it would fill this emptiness he felt. But he eventually realized that emptiness couldn't be filled from the outside.
So it had to come from a deeper place, from a sense of self-worth and self-love that wasn't tied to anything external, right?
Exactly. He talks about shifting from achieving to fill a void to being present to heal a void.
Hmm.
It's a powerful difference. It's not about giving up on your goals or anything, but it's about approaching them from a more grounded, wholehearted place.
It's like realizing that we're already enough just as we are, and that our worth isn't based on what we do or what we have.
He also mentions this thing called internal family systems. Have you heard of
I
that?
have. It's like it's a therapy model that sees the psyche as made up of different parts, or like the subpersonalities.
Yeah.
Each part has its own needs and desires and motivations.
Right. And Dial uses this to understand and accept the different sides of himself. Like he might have a part that's super driven and ambitious, and then another part that's more playful and creative.
And so instead of trying to ignore or shut down those parts, he tries to understand and integrate them.
It's like he's creating this inner harmony by acknowledging and honoring all the different parts of himself.
Makes sense. We're not like one-dimensional beings. We all have these different parts of ourselves that sometimes clash with each other. But when we can embrace those parts with compassion and understanding, we create a more integrated sense of self.
And that actually ties into this Buddhist concept Dial talks about called anartha. It's this idea that things we might see as unwanted can actually be used as tools for growth and helping others.
So it's like even our so-called negative qualities can have value when we use them for a higher purpose. Our flaws and imperfections become part of what makes us unique and contribute to our journey as a whole.
Exactly. Instead of trying to change who he is, Dial focuses on loving and accepting all parts of himself. He uses this cool analogy of an orchestra, where each instrument, even the ones that might sound a bit off, they all contribute to the overall symphony.
That's a great analogy. It really shows the beauty of diversity and the idea that we all have something unique to offer the world.
Mm.
And speaking of offering something to the world, that kind of leads us to another challenge Dial addresses. Finding balance in a world that's constantly trying to distract us.
He knows that finding balance between our day-to-day responsibilities and connecting to that deeper sense of self can be a constant struggle. He talks about how he used to be a total workaholic, always trying to fill every minute with something to do, but now he actually disconnects on purpose. He even deleted Instagram from his phone to cut down on those digital distractions and make it easier to be present in his real life.
It's a good example of how making even small intentional choices can make a big difference in how we connect with our deeper selves. Sometimes we just need to create boundaries and set limits to protect our time and energy.
And it's not just about disconnecting digitally either. He also talks about how important it is to be present with his wife and, his future kids. He doesn't want to look back and regret missing out on those precious moments because he was too caught up in the hustle.
It reminds us that our relationships are what really matter. At the end of the day, it's not about how much we achieve or how much stuff we have. It's about the connections we make and the love we share.
And that brings us to this really thought-provoking thing Dial says.
Yeah.
The more we prioritize peace and presence in our lives, the less we have to force our way through challenges. It's about trusting that when we're in tune with ourselves and connected to a sense of inner peace, the path forward becomes clearer and the journey itself is more enjoyable.
It's about letting go of the need to control everything and surrendering to the flow of life, right?
He actually says it like this: allowing life to happen through me instead of forcing things to happen.
That's a subtle but really important difference. It's about trusting the process and believing that we're exactly where we need to be, even when things feel uncertain or crazy.
And that circles back to what you said earlier, that it's all connected. Facing our fears, finding our why, cultivating inner peace, connecting to our true selves, making space for silence. It's all part of the same journey.
It's a whole person approach to growth. It's not about checking boxes or getting to a specific outcome. It's about becoming more whole, more integrated, more aligned with what we truly value and aspire to.
Before we jump into part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll get into Jay Shetty's final 5 questions and Rob Dial's really insightful answers, I want to leave you with something to think about. Dial talks about how in nature, things grow where they're vulnerable. A tree doesn't grow where it's thick and hard. It grows where it's soft and green and open to the elements. So what area of your life needs more vulnerability and less toughness to actually grow? What are you holding back? What are you afraid to show the world? And what might happen if you allowed yourself to be a little more open, a little more real, a little more vulnerable? We'll come back to this in part 2, but for now, just sit with that question and see what comes up.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into all this Rob Dial wisdom. It's really interesting to think about how, these different parts of our lives, our fears, our purpose, that need for silence is all kind of woven together.
Totally. And to kind of wrap our heads around all these big ideas, let's look at the final 5 questions that Jay Shetty asks at the end of his interviews. They're designed to get at someone's core beliefs and values, and Rob Dial's answers are, well, pretty insightful.
Okay, I'm ready for those wisdom bombs. What's the first question?
First one is, what's the best advice you've ever gotten? And Dial's answer, just one sentence. Everything is your fault.
Ooh, that's a bold statement. I'm not going to lie, my first instinct is to get a little defensive, but I have a feeling there's more to it than that.
Right. It sounds kind of harsh at first, but I think what he's saying is that it's super important to take ownership of our own lives.
Right.
It's not about blaming ourselves for everything that happens, but it's about realizing that we have the power to choose how we respond to things, even the tough stuff. Dial actually tells a story about a conversation he had with his first mentor who really pushed him to, step into that CEO role in his own life.
Okay, I like that, the CEO of your own life.
Yeah.
It implies that sense of responsibility and, actually having control.
Exactly. That mentor was saying that in a business, the CEO is ultimately responsible for both the successes and the failures. And it's the same in our own lives. We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we react, how we learn from it, and how we move forward. It's about moving away from that victim mentality and becoming more empowered.
Yeah, it makes me think about times when I've gotten stuck in that blame game. It's so easy to just point fingers and make excuses, but in the end, that just keeps us from moving forward. Taking responsibility, even when it's hard, is like the first step to making real change.
Okay, next question is, what's the worst advice you've ever gotten? Dial's answer is, fit in with everybody else.
Ugh, that's the worst advice ever. It's so tempting to try to please everyone and be what we think society expects of us. But I think deep down, we all know that real happiness comes from being true to ourselves.
Totally. And Dial really emphasizes that throughout the whole interview. He says that true fulfillment comes from embracing our individuality, appreciating what makes us unique and having the courage to be ourselves, even if it means not fitting in.
Makes you wonder what the world would be like if we all just embraced our weirdness and stopped trying to fit into these pre-made molds.
Yeah.
Imagine all the creativity and innovation that would come out of that.
Exactly. And speaking of embracing individuality, let's go to the third question. What's your most repeated thought? This one's particularly interesting because it gives us a glimpse into Dial's inner world and how he cultivates self-compassion.
Okay, tell me, what is it?
His answer is, I'm proud of you.
Oh, that's so nice. Such a simple phrase, but so powerful.
Good.
It shows how important self-love is and acknowledging our own efforts, even when no one else sees them.
He mentions that his mom used to say that to him a lot growing up, and now he does it for himself, just reinforcing that feeling of self-worth and self-acceptance. I love that. He's giving himself that kindness and encouragement that maybe he didn't always get. We could all use a little more of that for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that we don't always need someone else to validate us. We can be our own cheerleaders and celebrate our own wins, no matter how small.
That's a great habit to have. I'm definitely going to try to incorporate that into my own self-talk.
Okay, next up. What's the #1 habit that changed your life?
Ooh, curious about this one.
His answer, just 2 words: meditation and breathwork.
Makes sense. Those practices are all about slowing down, tuning in, and making space for stillness and reflection. And like we were talking about earlier, Dial believes that those quiet moments are when we can tap into our deepest wisdom, work through our emotions, and find the clarity and focus we need to deal with all the challenges life throws at us.
I have to admit, I used to be kind of skeptical about meditation. Thought it was just for hippies or something. But I finally tried it a few months ago, and I was surprised by how much it helped calm my anxiety and just feel more grounded. Yeah, it's like hitting the reset button for your mind, right? It gives you that space to step back from all the craziness of everyday life and connect with something deeper inside yourself.
And what's cool is that it doesn't have to be complicated. Even just taking a few minutes each day to focus on your breath can make a huge difference.
Right.
All right, last question. If you could make one law that everyone in the world had to follow, what would it be?
Okay, that's a big one. What did Dial come up with?
His answer, take 5 minutes every day to practice self-awareness.
That's so simple, but so profound. He believes that self-awareness is the key to solving a lot of the problems in the world.
He says that if we were all more aware of our own thoughts, feelings, and actions, and how those affect other people, we would make better choices, treat each other with more kindness, and create a more peaceful world.
It makes you think about how much conflict and suffering comes from just not being self-aware. Like we react without thinking, lash out at others, make decisions that hurt ourselves and the people around us all because we're not fully aware of what's driving our behavior.
Exactly. And it's not about being perfect or never messing up. It's about developing that awareness so we can catch ourselves in those moments and choose to do something different. It's about that pause between something happening and how we react.
That's where the magic is. That pause gives us the chance to choose a better, more compassionate response instead of just reacting automatically.
And Dial believes that even just 5 minutes a day of real self-reflection can make a huge difference. Whether it's through journaling, meditation, or even just sitting quietly and noticing our thoughts and feelings, that practice of looking inward can change our lives and then ripple out into the world.
Like that butterfly effect, right?
Mm.
Small changes in our own consciousness can lead to big shifts in the collective consciousness.
And that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. In part 3, we'll explore Dial's thoughts on vulnerability and circle back to that question I asked earlier about what areas of your life might need more vulnerability to really blossom. But before we move on, what's sticking with you the most from this conversation so far? Welcome back for the last part of our deep dive with Rob Dial. We're getting into this idea of vulnerability, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, me too. It's one of those things that I think people often get wrong. Like we think of vulnerability as a weakness, but Dow's saying it's actually where our strength comes from.
Yeah, he uses this really cool analogy from nature. He says that everything in nature grows where it's vulnerable. A tree, it doesn't grow where it's all thick and hard. It grows where it's soft and green, open to the elements and everything.
That's a powerful image. We tend to build up these walls to protect ourselves, but then those same walls end up keeping us from experiencing like all that life has to offer.
He's basically saying we got to be willing to let our guard down, to accept our imperfections and all that, and let people see us for who we really are. And that's where the real growth happens.
It's about realizing that true strength comes from being authentic, not from pretending to be someone we're not. It's about showing up, with our whole hearts, even the messy parts, the imperfect parts.
And that vulnerability, that willingness to be open and real, that's what lets us connect with other people on a deeper level, right? It creates this space for real connection and shared human experience.
It's like saying, hey, this is me, flaws and all. Do you accept me? And when we offer that vulnerability to others, it often encourages them to do the same. Like it creates this ripple effect of being real and connecting with each other.
And I think this goes back to what Dio was saying about, accepting yourself. When we can accept ourselves, even with our imperfections, we can offer that acceptance to other people too. We create space for compassion and understanding for ourselves and everyone around us.
It's about realizing that we're all in this together. Everyone has their own struggles, insecurities, fears. And when we acknowledge that shared experience, it brings this sense of belonging and connection that goes beyond our differences.
And that brings us back to that question I asked at the end of part 1. If everything in nature grows where it's vulnerable, what part of your life needs more vulnerability, less of that toughness to actually grow?
That's a really good question to think about. Like, where are we holding back? What are we scared to show the world? And what could happen if we just let ourselves be a little more open, a little more real, a little more vulnerable?
Maybe it's in our relationships. Are we letting those close to us really see us, know us? Or are we hiding behind masks and pretending to be someone we're not?
Maybe it's in like our creative stuff. Are we letting fear of judgment stop us from sharing our talents with everyone?
Or maybe it's in our own personal growth journey. Are we willing to face those darker parts of ourselves, acknowledge our weaknesses, ask for help when we need it?
Wherever that area of vulnerability is for you, I'd say lean into it. Embrace that discomfort. Trust that when you show up authentically, you're not just opening yourself up to more growth, you're inspiring other people to do the same.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Rob Dial's ideas, I think the big takeaway is this. Life isn't about being perfect. It's about connection. It's about accepting our imperfections, showing up as our true selves, and being vulnerable.
Yeah, it's about realizing that our flaws and fears aren't things to be ashamed of. They're actually chances for us to grow and connect with others.
And it's about trusting that when we open ourselves up to the world,